Well, Rick, you want to introduce John and we'll get started here?
Hopefully everybody knows John, but I really appreciate you doing this for us. We've been, with the whole quarantine thing, have been doing these virtual meetings. So we kind of started out with, we got Martin talking about water, and I don't know if you know Owen Langley from Imperial, but he joined us to talk about yeast, and Stan Hieronymus with hops. And so, you were the logical choice for malt. So we've kind of going through all those and just trying to pick people's brains and let you tell us everything you know about malt in the next
5 weeks.
Yeah, 30 minutes now, as long as it takes. I think you're muted right now, John.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think all I know about malt can fit inside of a malt kernel. So.
Yeah, I don't think.
Yeah.
No, this is fantastic. I've done. I did one other with another home group, and it was just super fun. I will tell you that I've got another group that I get together with every week, and it's just some brewing professional people from around the country. We get together every week. It's just fantastic. It's like there's some parts of COVID that are actually different, and there's a lot of stuff that sucks, but there's a few bright spots in there too. And talking to those.
We've been doing a BJCP class monthly, and that's been going well. The homebrew club, it's hard to get people to engage, and this is just a strange thing for a lot of people, but trying to stay connected. And like I said, really appreciate people like yourselves who are willing to take your time to share with us. And
yeah, absolutely. Well, oh, look at that! Somebody's waving. Hi. Pretty cool. That's awesome.
when I find their dad, I'm gonna just let them have him.
That's pretty good. Again, bright spots of COVID right there. Talk to me about what you want to know. Like, I would love to cultivate this discussion and talk about what you all want to know. Anything in particular?
Yeah.
anyone?
West County, we did that project.
I want to know what it means by well-modified malt versus, I guess, not well-modified malt. And particularly if that has only to do with the enzymes in it, or if there's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great opening question. Fantastic. So, if you think about the way that, malt is made, you've got this, barley that grows up and produces a seed, and then that seed is, has got the core components of the seed are, number one, the embryo, the thing that will become the young plant. Number two, the energy source for that, which is the starchy endosperm. And then number three, the outside husk, the container. And I really look at this as being a lot like an egg, right? There's a food source, So when that barley grows up, the way that the seed gets structured or ordered is that, that kernel needs to have stability, needs to be able to survive. So it ends up with this, the starchy endosperm is encased in this protein matrix. And if you think about it, it's like little nodules that are then coated in a thin layer of protein, then another nodule, coated with protein. And that's the way that the inside of the barley kernel is. So if you ever take barley, like pearled barley from the health food store, and you put it in your mouth, it'd be like trying to chew rice, right? You're going to about break a tooth. So when that plant finally, gets to where it needs, or when the seed finally gets to where it's going to be and where it's going to grow, and water is applied to it, then there's a whole series of cascading biological processes that are happening. And the first of those is it's starting to uptake water, and it uptakes water specifically from one end. And as that seed becomes hydrated and it becomes warm, like now it's going to start to sprout. And as it starts to sprout, the enzymes are going to take that very tough and unspoilable grain. I mean, there's grain that you can put grain in storage for, years or tens or hundreds of years and have it be good because it's not going to be degraded. So as you got this moisture in there, now it can start to be degraded. And the way it specifically degrades is that starting at the if you think about the barley kernel as having an end that's been attached to the plant and an end that's hanging away from the plant, that end that attaches to the plant, that's where the embryo sits. And at that place, this is the location where a lot of the enzymes that are going to be responsible for breaking apart the barley into usable resources for the young plant and for the brewer. And so these processes start to cascade from what they call the proximal end, the end that is closest to the plant, it would be when it's growing, out to the distal end, the far end. And so what's happening inside the barley kernel as we germinate it, because it really malting is a process of steeping, germination, and then kilning, drying. So in that germination phase, what's happening is that these enzymes are starting to break down the structures inside of the barley kernel. So that really hard aspect of barley starts to turn soft. It starts to turn malleable, right? It's malleable. And that malleable word is the same root as malt. So malt, as you masticate malt, it's malleable. Like you can crush it. Another thing that crushes things is a mallet. So malt and mallet and malleable are all sort of the same root. So as those enzymes are developing, like one, we're breaking down. We are breaking down the protein matrix that's making this thing super tough. Two, there's also these enzymes that are not developed yet. They're going to be able to break down starches into sugars, and that young plant would use those sugars to grow itself. So in the malting process, we're trying to enumerate or liberate or to build up the enzymes that will break starches down to sugars, but not actually break starches down to sugars yet. So those precursors are all coming together. So in when that happens, the process of enzyme development is separate but synonymous or simultaneous with protein degradation, the thing that makes malt able to be chewed. Like the fact that it's now soft, doesn't have this hard protein. So these two things, this enzyme development and this protein matrix destruction, are simultaneously. And there's a few other things that are happening during the malting process that are other measures of what's happening. Now, if we were to start that germination process, and again that it's moving from one side of the kernel to the other, and we only let it go a little ways, then only the proteins that are close to that are close to the endosperm have been modified, and the other parts are still really hard. And we also have pretty low amounts of enzymes. If we allow that to go so that protein degradation has occurred all the way through the kernel, now this is the sweet spot, because we as brewers can mill it successfully, we can mash it, we can get all the extract out of it, extract freely flows. But we can also let the thing overgrow. So like instead of growing it for 4 or 5 days, we grow it for 6, 7, 8 days. And at that point, what we're doing is we're utilizing the energy reserves to grow plant, but not to be able to make beer. So where we want to get to is to just get that modification to the tip of the barley, but no further. And when we've done that, we've fully modified the barley. We've fully modified the malt. So an under-modified malt, the under-modified malt would have perhaps have what they call a steely end. So this is like really tough stuff at the end of it, and The enzymes are not, when we go to mash it, the enzymes aren't in sufficient quantity maybe to mash easily. That the protein matrix, because it's not broken down, we can't actually get the enzymes in to break down the starches, so we get really poor utilization. And then on the other end, if we go over modify it, then we've used a bunch of extract that we can't now grow. We can't have yeast turn into alcohol. Instead, we've grown plant that we're not using. So fully modified it's usually the case of the barley is either under modified or fully modified. Rarely is it over modified. Does that make sense? It's kind of a long lesson, but or a long point. But does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
So if I think about, the barley as it starts to modify up and where we want to get it, there's all these different varieties of barleys that are used to make beer. And those different varieties have different characteristics in terms of how much they are growing. Now, barley breeding, you may end up with barleys that produce an enormous amount of enzyme, and that's very useful. And we could then, change our malting regime so that those enzymes, like the longer you modify something, the more enzymes you're going to get. So distillers are interested in malt as well as brewers, but distillers are looking for it to just drive a starch conversion reaction in their corn. So it's like, mostly corn, a little bit of malt, but the malt is the only thing with the enzymes. So they may be able to increase the amount of malt or increase the amount of corn adjunct that you're using relative to this malt. So they're looking for something that's like supercharged with enzymes that can break all this stuff down. So they'll over modify the malt to get those highest enzymes. They don't really care about the extract that's coming from it because it's, almost all of the extract is coming from corn. So some varieties will make more enzyme than others. And if I think about a measure of how strong a malt is, it may be extract, but I also could measure how much enzymes it has. As a brewer of all malt beer, I actually want to limit the amount of enzymes it has because it just can absolutely overpower my efforts as a brewer to control mash fermentability with, say, temperature. So one measure of that, the enzymatic strength is often related to the amount of soluble nitrogen, free amino nitrogen, soluble protein that's in the barley, inside the malt. And one way you could measure that is you take the amount of protein that the barley has, and that can range anywhere from like 8% to I've seen barleys at above 15. Not good for brewing in general. The distillers might like it. And then the amount that's broken down, you could take. Hold on one second. My wife is calling. I'll be right back.
Hey, I was wondering if everybody could mute unless you're talking, because I'm catching a lot of background from somebody.
My wife is trying to fly right now, and she may be having flight issues. So, can you hear me right now? Yes? Okay. I want to call her back because
She's more important than us.
we'll see. Sorry about that. Our son is going back to college and getting all set up with that. It's just, I don't know, COVID land, right? So So one measure of this is the amount of soluble protein versus total protein. And as a brewer, I look at this ratio, and it's sometimes called the Kolbach index, as an indice of how modified the malt is. Now, where a barley, and so if I take, if I have a 10% protein barley, and half of that becomes soluble, then when I measure the barley, I could say there's 5% soluble, 5% insoluble protein, and that would be a 50% Kolbach index. Different barleys end up with different Kolbach indices when they are fully modified. So there's some very hot, what they call hot or enzymatically active barleys out there that when they're fully modified, they're producing a lot of enzymes. And for large American or North American brewers, that's of interest because you could drive enough, you can use this enzyme to convert an enormous amount of corn or rice into, from the starch state into the fermentable sugar state. So as a brewer of all malt beers, I'm very interested in those barleys that are going to have the right amount of soluble nitrogen relative to the whole thing. And so one of the questions you get is my barley fully modified? That's a question that the maltster needs to ask, did I make malt? And the brewer wants to ask because is this stuff going to work? And one way you could do that is to take a look at the malt certificate of analysis, the measurables to determine, did I make malt? But if I look at that independent of the barley variety, then the analogy I like to use for this is, if I came to you and I said, I have a 60-pound dog, is it overweight? Is it a Chihuahua? Is it a Saint Bernard? Because that matters. If it's a Labrador, then yeah, your dog's in shape, right? So in a lot of ways, like the question of modification and protein and soluble nitrogen or soluble proteins is really related to modification and knowing like what that barley variety should be when it's fully modified. You guys are getting like full nerd, by the way.
It's good.
All right.
Michael, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, John,
Okay.
I had two questions, John. I put them on the chat. So,
Yep. The degradation. Yep.
And then also, what's the difference between pale ale in U.S. and pale ale in Germany or Britain and all that?
Yeah. So the first question, how does malt degrade over time? We only get our malt from the homebrew shop. How long will it remain fresh or usable for competition beers? So absolutely depends on storage conditions. In a lot of ways, barley is very stable and malt is very stable as well. I was actually in Switzerland years ago looking to buy some equipment, brewery over there from a defunct brewery. And they had an enormous amount of malt storage relative to the size of the brewery. And I asked about that. And they said, well, during World War II, we got all of our barley used to come from Germany. And during World War II, it just decimated the industry. And so therefore there was some laws put in that said, if you're going to be a brewery, you got to maintain these basically a year's worth of supply of malt. So, so that's what the practice they had. Now, is there a difference between storing malt in the high alpine region of Switzerland, where it's cold and dry, and say, my buddy Fal, who brewed over in Singapore for years, warm, humid, like a mess. And the primary things that will spoil malt are, number one, insect infestation. I mean, you've basically got this huge, hold on a second, call my wife. We're good. Sorry. So that's, insect degradation is going to be one thing. A second thing that really causes malt to become bad is if it becomes moist, then what they call slack, and this causes degradation as well. So I think about if I wanted to store malt for a longer time, if I had it in some moisture controlled circumstance, whether that's good moisture barrier bag like a Mylar bag, put it somewhere cold like your freezer. I mean, that's going to be really different than, hey, I put it out, I left it in a pan in my shed during the rainstorm. So how long should the malt stay good under sort of standard, if you had it in an air conditioned store? Yeah, it'll stay good for a while. I mean, those are closer to Switzerland than they are to Singapore kind of conditions. The second question is, what's the difference between U.S. malt and British malt or German malt? So those are related to barley variety. They're related to malting practice, like what they're, how they're making their malt. And they're related to growing conditions. Like what does the growing condition look like? So if I think about U.S. Or let's start with British, because I love British malts. The English grow barley that is suitable for all malt beers. Like that's what they want to mainly grow. So when they're fully modified, the Kolbach's at a nice place. And traditionally, the English, as they dried their malt, dried it to a color that was, pale ale malt. It's deeper than like what the English would call white malt, or what the U.S. would have as base two-row brewer's malt. And that's going to put the minimum amount of heat on there. So those malts are going to end up with, because they're dried at a warmer temperature, they pick up flavors in the kiln of sort of malty, toasty deliciousness. And the other thing they do is that when those pale ale malts are kilned, they're at a high enough temperature that they actually degrade the precursor for dimethyl sulfide, cooked corn, DMS. So on a sort of like a proper British pale ale, they may have super crappy brew house processes, but they don't end up with a lot of DMS. Now, if you contrast that with, I'm going to change this question, because I'm going to take the other extreme in Europe, which is a Czech malt. So, like Moravian barley malted in Pilsen. The tradition there was those malts, those barleys were pretty low in nitrogen. They were malted very cold and very slow. They were kilned under very low temperature conditions. And even though they malted them for a long time, they were still a little undermodified. So because the enzymes weren't there, because the substrates weren't there, they don't pick up very much color. They can throw DMS, like forever. But they make these really delicious, just beautiful pale beers, but require intensive mashing, triple decoction, right? Pilsner or Quell, triple decoction. They require, boil times and boil practices that strip out that DMS, all related to that malt. Because those beers, neither one of those beers has DMS. The English, because of the high malting temperature, the Czech, because they boiled the beer for, in a sufficient way to reduce it down. In the United States, we've really driven our barley supply to be hotter, have higher protein levels, have more enzymatic activity. And so when those are modified, they've just got more sort of power to them. And that's not what I want. I don't want a lot of power in my malt for those. So that's sort of like where the, standard just US based two-row brewer's malt, using the popular barley varieties of today sit. And I thought the last question was, I was going kind of nerd. Now I'm like uber nerd.
So John,
Michael?
going back to that,
Oh.
that previous question about modification, I mean, are there any malts out there on the market that are more under modified that maybe, and if, you know, what styles of beer or types of beer or qualities of the wort would you get from that? You know, is there a preference for certain styles or for under modified malts?
Yeah, so when I think about this, years ago, it kind of depends on where taxes are assessed and a couple other things where some of these practices originated from or go to. But if I think about a traditional floor malted Czech malt, which I've got some access into friends who use these. They would be slightly under modified. Now the Germans have largely transitioned to fully modifying the barleys, and they do this for a couple of reasons. Traditional brewing practice in Germany, this triple decoction, double decoction. The reason why that exists is because the meager power of enzymes present in the malt needed to be fully accessed. So if you think about rice is got the protein matrix and the starch and all this stuff that makes it like barley, but we can make rice palatable as humans by cooking it fully. And so that decoction process, we might have a barley kernel that is partially modified on one end, and on the other end, that distal end, it's not modified. But if I take that and I boil it, then really it's like I'm cooking rice. And then I bring that now cooked starch back into the rich enzyme soup that is the mash, the retained portion of the mash in a decoction, and all of a sudden that's now accessible, like it's going out there. So the German brewers would have these very long and intensive mashing procedures, in part to deal with lower levels of modification. Now you fast forward to 2020, and what brewer is interested in they're looking at their business and they think like, what I really need? I need to be able to put through the maximum of 3 brews today. Like if they're able to turn that equipment more effectively, and all it takes is a discussion with their maltster to get the malt that now is a little more modified. Maybe I'm getting a slightly less of potentially soluble extract, but because it's freely available, I'm actually going to get more from it. That's where they're transitioning to. That's where they've transitioned to, is simpler and simpler mash programs over there. And I'll tell you, when I've been brewing beer professionally for 30 something years, and I was really interested. I got into started running a brewery that was a lager beer brewery, and I was like, I want to play in all this stuff, and won't triple decocted be that much better? And what I found was that the enzymes, I was using American malts because that's what we had. And with those American malts, or even fully modified German malts, that when I went through that whole decoction process, the enzymes which break down starches, those are developed at the same times that the enzymes that break down proteins are developed. So now I'm subjecting my barley and my mash, my malt and my mash, to a very high enzymatic activity. And those protein degrading enzymes, the proteolytic enzymes, are breaking apart the proteins that are responsible for beer foam, that are responsible for body. And I end up with this like thin, flat, doesn't throw a foam, schaum beer in the end, because I've overmashed it. I've used supercharged malt or pretty charged up malt and given it every opportunity to do everything it can, and it now is just, it blows the beer. So I need to match. In a lot of ways, you have this. You think about making a great beer. I need to match my brewing technique to my malt, to the proper malt, which that make the proper malt, I need the proper barley. So it's this integrated system that I could make great beer if I was using a traditional Czech barley under-modified with triple decoction. That makes fantastic beer with fantastic foam. I can make a fantastic beer with fantastic foam with a modern American malt that is properly modified, mashed for a short amount of time, so I'm not, over getting this stuff and going. And in the end, the outcomes are both fantastic beers, but coming about it from very different places. And if I used technique A with raw ingredient B, it's a shit show. It's, totally doesn't work. Now, for the most part, if you're buying, even if you're buying British barleys or British malts, most of those malts are made from barleys that are in the current, sort of like in the current style. So things like, if I'm talking about barley varieties, I might be talking about Propino or Optic or these kinds of varieties. There are some varieties that have been around for a very long time and continue to be grown. One of those is Maris Otter. Another is Golden Promise. So Maris Otter is, I'd like to tell you it's an old variety, but I think it was developed about the same time I was developed. So it's definitely not an old variety. That thing's just coming into its prime, okay? Let's just be perfectly clear that 50 some odd years is good. Now, if I think about Maris Otter, what does it do? For the farmer, it doesn't, the yields aren't there. Like, so the farmer has an acre of land and they plant Maris Otter, they're only going to get about, this many tons of barley off of it. And if they planted it with the new variety, they're going to get much more, and it's going to be better disease resistant and better, just better agronomically. So if I, as a brewer, say I value Maris Otter and I want to use it, then I need to be prepared to pay more because it costs more to grow the shit. They didn't, they had the same acre of land, they just didn't get as much off. They still got to make their, they still put fertilizer on, they still got to make their money. So I think that's a pretty, I think those are kind of special malts. And there's some other, traditional either American or German or, Swedish malts or Swedish barleys that are out there that people play with to kind of to find out what was the flavor back then. What was that like, And in some cases it might be better. Now I'll tell you, here in Michigan, we have a long tradition of, of agriculture. I mean, our state is fantastic with agriculture. I think we're the second most variety of agriculture brought to market outside of California. First state agricultural school, and that Michigan State University, where that first agricultural school is. And by the way, I'm not like your Spartan, I'm not originally from Michigan, so we're not going to get into the Ohio State, thing, because, that would get ugly, right? But at Michigan State, there was a breeder, one of the I think he was the first seed breeder hired by a university in the United States. And he developed this barley variety, which is called Spartan. And, I got Spartan from a seed repository out in Idaho years ago, and I started to grow it because we had a barley farming operation at Bell's, small scale. Like, we'd grow 140 acres. I mean, it was a fair amount, but I mean, it's not like, it wasn't like, our big line of business. Basically, we found out that we're really shitty barley farmers. We don't know what the fuck we're doing. And but I planted some of this Spartan out there in a test plot. And I was, it was not great. And I think stuff from our history is awesome. It's interesting. It gives a window into things. I will also tell you that Ford Motor Company is not going to announce that they have done away with, hybrid vehicles and are moving, the new entry for the 2022 market is going to be a reboot of the Model T. terrible mileage, no pickup, horrible reliability. Like, there's a reason why the Model T is no longer being produced. And I firmly believe there's a reason why Spartan is not being grown on a wide range. It's interesting. I love going to a parade. I mean, Bell's has a Model T that, we drive around and it's kind of cool, but it's nothing I want to drive to work on a snowy day, and likewise with these barleys. So. What are you all drinking, by the way?
Two-Hearted.
Nice. All right.
I do have a question. Have you ever noticed the difference between winter and spring barley?
So winter and spring, there is a difference. I will tell you that some of basically the winter barleys are planted in the fall. They overwinter and then they grow up and they're harvested. They're mature earlier. Spring barleys are planted in the spring after the ground has thawed. There is a thing called winter kill that occurs where harsher growing conditions can cause real problems, and you basically kill the crop. And we've had that experience on our farm. There's a lot of work that's being done on this, and I think that, do you all know Eric Stockinger? Have you ever heard that name?
No.
Fantastic barley researcher from Ohio. And he is really, really into winter barleys. And I think about in Ohio, like, if I think about the traditional barley growing areas of Michigan, they're up by the, they do this in Michigan, right? So they're up here in the thumb. And that's a lot, that's a lot colder than, central Ohio. So he's doing a lot of work on winters. Some of those traditional British barley varieties we were talking about, those are winters. Winters tend to have slightly lower protein, which is of interest to me. And in places like we are, where it's humid and the growing conditions would favor development of mold and problems associated with that, they're less susceptible because they're off the field earlier. Think about barley harvest going on. Sometimes they call it the Great White Reaper. A hailstorm or a big rainstorm that comes through and just destroys stuff. So those winters are pretty cool. One of the companies that's doing a bunch of work on this is, do you know Origin Malt? Are you familiar with them at all? So Origin is a malting concern that's starting up in a state called Ohio, apparently. They are looking to build a 50,000 metric ton malting facility in Ohio. And they're not that different. There's another company here in Michigan that's doing something similar called Independent. Actually, not that far from us. And another one in Delaware called Proximity. And these are all brand new malting operations that are coming in. The folks at Origin have done a bunch of work with Dr. Stockinger, and are really trying to develop these winters for growth in Ohio. I think this is fascinating. I think it's super cool, and being able to get the barley closer to the point of use is fantastic. So very interested in what they're doing. And the people that are involved with it are seasoned malting professionals who know what they are doing.
So would you say that then most English malts are winter barley?
I have not gone through to see what's winter and what's spring, but yeah, in general, yeah. I think they're mainly winters.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is like Mallett gets to go do the Nerd Fest thing.
I have a question about substitution of malts.
Yeah.
I'm always kind of confused. What's an equal substitution? Also, what's the difference? I mean, I understand there are differences, but say I do a lot of Belgians, but you do Belgians or you mix with German or you mix with American crystal malts or whatever.
Yep.
Can you kind of go down that road a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think, when we think about barley and malt and kind of the way it manifests itself and how, inside the beer and what we're looking to do. I think in some ways the hardest malts to think about with substitutions are those dark but not completely black malts. Because if you just said, hey, I want to use a malt with this color and I can, and I just choose another malt of the same color, there could be radically different ways to get to that color. So some of the ways you could do that, I could take a barley and malt it and turn it into what the English call white malt or base malt. And then if I put it in a coffee roaster and I roast it, then I'm going to get color out of it. I could also take that malt and soak it in water and allow it to convert starches into sugars and then bring that up under low temperature and produce these fantastic Maillard reactions that, make great caramel sweetness, all this. And it's the same color. I mean, if you look at the SRM or Lovabond, those two malts are the same by that metric. But the way that they got there, one of them is like dry and toasty and, super kind of, astringent biscuity. And the other is super sweet and, light and candy-like. I can't substitute one for the other. They're totally different flavor outcomes inside the beer. So when we get to very pale malts, the range of variation is pretty small. The levers that we could pull, we can't put heat on it because heat is just going to make things get darker. So to get something really pale, the heat is off the table. I could under-modify it, so I have less starches, I have less enzymes, I have less potential, free amino nitrogen, broken down proteins, which combine to make color. Or I could fully modify it and dry it at very, very low heat, and I could get to similar color outcomes. But by and large, and then if we go on the other end of the spectrum, like black malt is pretty much charcoal. It's broken down to about as far as it's going to get broken down to, and pretty soon it actually loses color and or will spontaneously combust as you're brewing with it. So if I think about how the malt is made, like Special B, do you guys use Special B? I love that malt. And it's really easy to use too much of it, right? I mean, we've all had those beers that it's just like, good idea, a little less. But that malt's made in a way that combines both high temperature dry roasting and also the caramelization. So it's like sort of like lightly caramelized and then high temperature roasted. And I mean, it's delicious stuff, but it's a unique malt. And I know that like Brees has tried to play with making something similar to that, but they're using different barleys to do it. So, so I think kind of looking back to think about what the barley, the root of the barley is, and also that processing that helps to drive. For us, if we needed to make a substitution, that's where I would go to. We're not doing a lot of substitution. I mean, we're talking to our supply chain is pretty tight in terms of good communication with our maltsters and all that. I see there's another question in the chat. So what's the state of the U.S. barley production? Can we expect some shortages due to weather or increased demand from microbreweries? The short answer is that I want to say I just saw the National Agricultural Statistics Barley Report. It came out earlier this week. eagerly awaited. I mean, I'm sure everybody here was at the edge of their seat like I was. But we're pretty flat. It's like 4% off or something like this. And, a lot of this is the amount of barley that's being carried over. Stocks go up, then they trims down a little bit, but there's not a significant increase or decrease there. The demand for microbreweries is appreciable for malting, but, barley also has other homes as well. And some of that's cattle feed, that decreases over time. So less barley is being grown in the country. But in the end, what it means is that you're not going to see a shortage so much as a lack of selection. So if I want a barley with this characteristic, and there's 4 times as much barley grown as there's going to be malt produced, then the maltster who's going to pay a premium is able to say, like, I want that, but not that. Now, if there's only twice as much produced, then they've got less options for rejection. I think that part of this is also coupled with the better communication between maltsters and growers about what is acceptable and, all that. Now, the weather events, the Great White Reaper comes in and, the barley crop in Montana gets wiped out. That's a different conversation, but that's not happening right now. Like, we've got no extingent outward pricing pressures right now or sourcing pressures right now. So I don't think we need to worry about it. Like, there's often, I sit in these meetings and groups trying to drive like U.S. barley supply, and sometimes, barley are decreasing and maybe we're not going to run into a shortage. As long as brewers are willing to pay a farmer, the farmers are going to grow it. And I'm getting this, I tell you, I've had a couple conversations this week on the hop side where people are like, well, the farmers don't want to grow Centennial. And, I've got a huge vested interest in Centennial. I'm very advocate, huge proponent of that hop. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Because the farmers I'm talking to, they're like calling me up and saying, like, we want to grow Centennial for you. Like, I don't see there's any shortage. Like, as long as I at Bell's say, we want to buy this amount, they're like, great. We're going to grow it for you because you pay your bills on time and we want to sell stuff, right? So I don't think we need to worry about shortage at this point.
So I've got a question. If I have a specific beer style and a list of malts I need to use, how would I go about selecting the maltster? And does it really make a big difference for what I could get at the local homebrew shop?
Yeah, so if you could buy either, crisp or raw or whatever else. Can I ask a question? I'm not learning much right now, and I like learning stuff. So what kinds of malts do you have available? Like, what's available at your homebrew, like your local homebrew shop? That's super interesting to me.
We have Wireman, we have Raw, we have Crisp. Of course, Brees is big. Muttons. Trying to think of who else is out there.
They've started getting some Admiral.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Too. Not a lot, but a few other varieties.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big variety. That's super cool. I mean, in some ways I look at, where they're, somebody like Wireman, Wireman and Brees are playing in the same pool in different places. Both of them, ship small amounts of malt to especially small brewers. And Wireman is active globally. I've been in the Wireman warehouse in South Africa. So they're about making this large variety. I mean, do you ever get Castle? You ever see that stuff? Castle is like a Belgian malting that they make an incredible variety of malts. But I think they're trying to play in that same category. In terms of like what the style of beer I'm making, I think Raw is like, they're fantastic, family-owned, great company. Love doing business with them. Super smart people. And they, if I'm making like American Pale Ale, like that's a great malt to start with, like some of those malts. The Wireman has some sourcing for like some of that Pilsner malt that they're getting out of. They've got a floor malting operation over in Czech Republic. Like, who has got that? I mean, there's not that many of those malts that are accessible. Somebody like Admiral, they're playing with, new American, like, let's see where the boundaries can be. And, I love that. So kind of like, what style are we making? What are we doing? What are we looking to make with beer? That will drive a lot of my decision. None of the maltsters you mentioned are ones that make me recoil in fear. I'll tell you, at one point, years ago, and this is no longer the case, but there were basically 4 maltsters in the United States and 1 specialty maltster, or specialty ingredient manufacturer, as the indomitable Joe Hertrick said once. And that specialty ingredient manufacturer was named Brees Malt. So Brees Malt is like tiny compared to the other 4 at that time. Of those other 4, one of them was named Archer Daniels Midland, and another one was named Cargill. Giant agribusinesses. And, I will tell you that at Bell's, my job to source malt got real easy because Larry Bell was like, we're not buying from those 2 companies. I don't like those companies. They do terrible things to American farmers, small American farmers. We're not buying from them. Okay, we're not buying from them. I'm on board. Now, both of those concerns have been sold, and different groups now operate them, and much better malt focus, and less big. But now there's this incredible blossoming of very small maltsters and medium small maltsters and medium maltsters, and I just think it's like we're living in a pretty good time in terms of checking out different malts. I especially think about these maltsters that are playing in small batch size. They can make a goofy malt. They can make a crystal rye. You think about somebody like, if Cargill is operating a plant that basically makes a trainload of malt every batch, they're going to make crystal rye. They don't know how to do it. They screw it up. They've got, a rail car of cattle feed. So I love looking at some of these malts because it's, when was crystal rye ever around? It's kind of cool.
Have you ever used Great Western?
Yeah. Larger company. They've got a couple of different operations out there, and they're part of a much larger group that's I think they're owned by the Australians right now, but solid malt. That Great Western, what they call blue, it's got a blue print on the bags. Lot of my Portland brewing buddies are using that as their stock malt.
Yeah, Jamil Zainashev swears by their pale.
Yep. And I mean, Great Western, it's interesting that, if I think about malt, there's the company that's got the name on it, but the malting company may have multiple malting facilities. And is the malt different from different malting facilities?
Oh, yes.
So where it's coming from is important for me. This right now at this time of the year, like mid-August, usually I'm in a car for a week making a tour of all of our malting partners and, having important conversations, but also crawling around on my hands and knees, trying to look are things clean here? Is this a place that I would be proud to tell a Bell's drinker that their malt came from? And certainly, if there was we've had tough conversations and we've moved our malting business before. So, and just from one plant to another, you guys need to get this thing lined up better. So I think it's also where it's coming from.
I have 2 questions, one kind of off the wall. The first one, though, is on your Two Hearted Ale, is that dry hopped?
I think the French phrase for that is "fuck yeah."
Do you do it right early on in the fermentation process or later on?
No, early on. So Two-Hearted's interesting beer. It's actually two different beers that are put together, and this is to drive outcomes that I've wanted. It's a very simple beer. It's a single hop, but there's a complexity to the production of it. What we do with that beer is that we will knock out a wort from the brew house, and the wort from the two different beers is the same. We knock out a wort into the brew house into a fermenter, and the fermenters that we use they've got a particular geometry to them. They are very wide, so the beer is actually shallow in the tank, and then the bottom of the tank has got a very shallow cone to it. So if you think about it, it's more like, less like a 55-gallon drum and more like a saute pan. Now, not that much, but wider, shallower. The fermentation of that beer kicks off, and then we will dry hop it during active fermentation. And this does a couple of things. And we've been doing this for like 20-something years, right? Apparently, there's this new hot thing called biotransformation, where if you put hops together with active yeast, then amazing fruity flavors can be developed inside of the beer. We're going to try that one day.
So are those shallow fermenters because of hydrostatic pressure?
Yeah, I look at the convection currents inside of the tank, and the taller the tank you have, the more convection you have going on, and this acts as a scrubbing mechanism, so it will carry. I think about Two-Hearted has an amazing aroma, right? The flavor most of it is carried in the aroma, and that those components which are being brought up by CO2, evolving inside the beer. Those compounds are selectively attracted to that bubble, lofted up and expressed. So if I do all of that work, if I do all of that rousing in fermentation, then those flavors that I really actually want to get to the beer drinker are gone.
Yep.
So if I can shallow this fermenter, I get less of that. The second thing is that we dump all these hops in there, and then the hops settle through the beer, and then they settle on the bottom. Well, if I've got this tall, thin tank with a tight cone, all of that hop goes to the bottom of the tank, and then it's like in a little brick. It's not exposed to the beer. So I want something where this hop is going to settle out on a big area, and we maximize that contact and allow that natural process to occur slowly to extract those fantastic aromas and then not scrub them out. So, that dry hopping process, we then need to get the dry hops out before we get the beer in a bottle, because dry hops don't go through a filler very well. Also, nobody wants to drink through a coffee filter. So we'll pull those hops out, but I want live yeast in there. So we've actually got a second beer, which we call unhearted. So Two-Hearted is actually a combination of overhearted and unhearted, and that unhearted acts as a yeast source carrier. Like, we're looking for a different set of things out of that, and those get come together to make Two-Hearted as a beer. So yeah, we're dry hopping the shit out of that stuff. I mean, the majority of the hops that I buy that we use at Bell's go in the fermenter. They do not go in the kettle. More hops go into the cellar than they do into the brew house by a long shot.
So
Okay,
John,
so here's my second question. Thank you so much for that. We live right on the border of Ohio, Kentucky. And of course, Kentucky is the great bourbon state. And I went down to a local bourbon house, and we had a Michter's tasting from Michter's Distillery.
Okay.
And the master distiller Pam Heilman was there. And I had mentioned in passing that I was a brewer. Well, afterwards, she approached me and she said, we are looking at putting a crystal malt in with.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know what I told her. If she had asked you that question, what malt would you recommend for her?
I don't know what their process is, like how they're doing, if they're a traditional bourbon house. So there are some interesting bourbons that are being made using specialty malts. Like Breeze sells to some distilleries for this kind of thing. I'm a guy, so I should be able to speak with authority about shit I don't know about.
I love it.
But I'm not going to do that. So I don't know that much about it, but certainly there's a bunch of distillers that are using these interesting malts. And I've not bbeen through that.
Yeah, well, because I'm a guy, I didn't give a shit, and I did answer her. I went with the most obvious answer for me. I said, a Crystal 80 is just a great around crystal. I mean, it's just, it's in that sweet spot. And so I told her maybe a Crystal 80. Now, if this bourbon turns out like shit, I'm not taking responsibility.
That's also a guy thing, but no. I mean, something to think about distilling, and you're taking this, you're making a mash. I mean, in some of those distilleries, they just smell disgusting, right? But you're making this mash, and then when you distill it, you're really pulling off, a really good column still. You're going to pull something that's almost pure alcohol. It's vaporized, like the alcohol has boiled, and now we're recondensing it. So I'm wondering what part of the crystal malt boils at that very specific temperature. It's not heads, it's not tails, it's in the fat part of the pot. What attribute in that malt is being lofted up and moving on to the final whiskey? I gotta believe it's something, it would be aromatic, if anything. It's not gonna be like the color. Like, we got this amazing, because I mean, all those whiskeys, as they come off the still as White Dog, they're clear. They're picking up all their color from the barrel. So, I mean, if you presumably, and the mashes that they're working with, I mean, you look at those things and some of those are pretty sketch, right? And they've got color, but that color's not transmitting.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's some like pretty well-regarded American spirits that are made using some specialty malts. They clearly, like, these are producers that I respect. They're doing something. What it is, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I can say this. 2 years ago, when I went to this bourbon tasting, Mittner's was not using specialty malts. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know what the hell they're doing now, but I'm just telling you, they didn't. And that's a hell of a bourbon.
Yeah. Huh. I've not had it. I'll have to make a visit.
Actually, I think the best, I know we're doing beer here, but I think the best is there's an American whiskey. And the thing about bourbon is it can only be in a barrel one time. The American whiskey uses reused bourbon barrels for half and true bourbon and mixes it. And it's just spectacular, if you like that kind of thing.
I have been known to like that kind of thing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Hey, John, I had a question going back to, your early use of biotransformation before it was cool. So was that a product of, was that a conscious decision to put the hops in that early, or did you experiment? I mean, how did you arrive at that sort of early dry hopping approach?
So when I I came to Bell's about 20 years ago. And when I got there, I was coming there to build a new brewery. And the production capabilities were pretty challenged. It's early, it's earlier in craft. I mean, it was still, I mean, Bell's has been around for 35 years at this point. But we basically were fermenting beers in giant open fermenters. And in terms of when those hops were going in, they were going in early. So as we transitioned from, I wanted to maintain microbiological control. And so I started to transfer our beer production into closed and more easily controlled vessels. And as I did that, you sort of think like, okay, well, you don't want to change anything. You want the beer to remain the same, but you're changing the vessel. And, sort of if at one point, like Two Hearted, we didn't make very much Two Hearted. There just wasn't that much interest in IPA at that time. And as IPA started to grow, we're trying to figure out how do we make more of this. We need to buy more tanks or whatever else. And in terms of where and when the hops went in, started to play with that a little bit. And there was a difference. There was a clear difference between putting hops in while we're still in active ferment. And part of this is about just how beer gets transferred and moved. And if you got the beer, especially if you got the beer cold, did not like that characteristic. That was not Two Hearted. And so we really kind of framed and refined and figured out what do we need to do to make the beer taste consistently awesome in this way. And that included putting hops in the fermentation early on, like we had done from day one. If I think about what the pieces that drive dry hop timing, you put them in too early, fermentation is very vigorous, you're driving off too much volatiles. You put them in midway through the fermentation, at this point you're taking a raw agricultural ingredient, you're putting it in fermentation, and so therefore the yeast is no longer pure and sterile, and you cannot reuse that yeast, to my way of thinking. Now other breweries may do that, but I'm like, that is now, polluted. You take the beer and you ferment it fully and you chill it down and you remove the viable yeast so that you can repitch it. It's fantastic. Like you can make a lot of beer that way. But the dry hop character changes. And specifically, you no longer have this biotransformation. And if I think about like a really good Two Hearted, what I want to smell in there, I want to smell a little bit of pine. I want this sort of like lime zest. I want this deeper kind of orange character, like almost roasted orange. I want a dark fruit like cherry, like a really, really ripe, great cherry. These are flavors I want. I do not want onion garlic. There are great beers out there with onion garlic in it, like a dank, diesel-y kind of character. I don't want that in there. So these are the characteristics that we're really trying to get. And most importantly, I'm looking for this floral character, this like rose character that you can get. And that is absolutely brilliant to win those hops going, because that's not, I'm never rubbing hops. I'm like, oh, big rose. No. That comes from fermentation. And that's something that we figured out a while ago. And that I was really looking to drive a beer that in some ways emulated a fruit in terms of being able to have this balance of characteristics. So with that, it's drawn, it is driven capital project campaigns. Like the brewery is unlike any other brewery because we've got, again, we ferment Two Hearted in 400 barrel tanks, shallow tanks that are really just set up for 200, or just set up for Two Hearted, and there's like 30 of them. And that's just warm fermentation. So again, I feel like it's a super simple beer, single hop. How hard could that be? But the hoops and the decisions and the capital that we've thrown in to make it are really different.
Question related to that. Like so many home brewers, I've tried by hand at making a two-hearted clone numerous times.
Yeah.
My last one, I figured I took a trip up to the general store up there. I got some of your house yeast. I got some of the
hops.
Centennial hops. And I splurged and I used some pale ale from Mecca Grade out in Oregon.
Uh-huh.
And started at 1.065. And this stuff fermented all the way down to 0.004. It ended up being a good beer, but it was
different.
Very dry, almost like a brute. And kind of going back to something you said earlier, caught my attention about the over mashing. Is that just an example of that particular malt was so efficient that I'd be better off just cutting back on my mash time to leave more body in the beer?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, you don't want that. I mean, we have a weekly call with our malting partners to talk about like what fermentability looks like and how hot is the malt. You know, we look at some analytics, but we're also talking about the lived experience of brewing with their malts and what they need to do to change that. So yeah, that to me sounds like that malt may have been, I mean, Mecca Grade, small malting concern. I don't know what the growing conditions were that year, but if it was a dry year, they could have high protein levels, which then would equate to very high enzyme levels, depending on kind of where that thing got pushed. It could be very, very active enzymatically and just want to drive there. I buy specific, like when I'm buying malt, that conversation is happening a year in advance. We're saying, these are the barley varieties we want you to access. And here are the quality specifications for the incoming barley into your maltings. So that you can when you hit these malting specifications, we're delivered to the brewery. So again, I think that the malt choice is important. I will also say that the process is very important. And I'm pretty gregarious, but I'm not going to give away all the secrets. And I can give away exact formulation and tell you, here's what goes in Two Hearted, and that beer's not going to come out the same. And I know that. I absolutely know that, because the way that the way that brewery's configured, the way that we're making the beer, that's important, is an important ingredient to what's going on.
So, John, a question about mashing and kind of the malts that we have today that are highly modified. In a lot of the classic literature, it's always mash for 60 minutes and you should be good to go. And I've gotten well away from that, where I'm checking at 30 minutes and usually it's done. I mean, from a homebrew standpoint, I mean, starch chest is obviously the most thing, but what are your thoughts on that? It seems like, everyone's probably mashing or has been told to mash for way longer than they need to.
Yeah, I agree. My daughter's like a barista, in college. That's what she's putting herself through, is making super fancy coffees. And so we're always talking about grinds and extraction and all this. And I know from her that if I take a good coffee and I put it in water and I let it sit for a long time before I pull it away from the grounds, then I'm going to get these really nasty tannic characteristics. Over extracted is what she calls it. And I think that's absolutely the case with malt as well. That the deficit that she has with something where she's not over extracting it, she's not pulling every bit of flavor out of the coffee, it's probably not as efficient. You could probably make more coffee if you did it in a shitty, let it sit there and pulled everything out of it. But she doesn't want, she wants that good part of it. So therefore the coffee goes in a specific temperature, it sits resident with it for a pretty short amount of time, and then it's pulled away from the grounds. And the coffees are beautiful that way. And in the same way, the malt is the same way. Realistically, the amount of enzymatic activity and the amount of modification that has gone through with the malts, you could pretty much mash and louder, and you're good. Like, unless you're using some goofy malt that that's not well modified, that could carry starch over. But, a 5-minute mash rest. Now, you might be slightly less efficient, like 3%. But what's 3% in home? Like in home brewing, 3%, like, what is that? 3 cents? 20 cents? Like what? Like, what the fuck do I care? I want to make a better beer.
Kind of along the same lines of that, like just with like different extraction stuff, but like, like the home brewer, Gordon Strong, he swears by in his books about recirculating, sparging only the roasted malts, the darker grains.
Yep.
Do you guys do anything associated with like, just like lighter pale ale, pilsner malts? And then when you recirculate or sparge or anything like that, do you guys then have any beers where you would add the roasted grains and the special Bs and the darker grains, or you just kind of mash all at once?
We mash all at once, but we mash under different circumstances. So more importantly, milling. So, milling is an important step in brewing. The mill that we utilize is a wet mill. And what that means is we pull together our mash bill, like, all the barleys into a tank, into a hopper. And our mill is set up so that as that barley flows to the mill, a bunch of hot water is added to it. And it is in contact with that barley for about 3 minutes before that barley hits the mill rollers. And that's just like the way that it flows through this, it's hopper, hydration chamber, rolls. And what comes out of the bottom of the mill is a mash at the right temperature with the right ratio of water. What has gone on before it hit the rolls is that the barley kernel, the malt kernel, has got this dry outer husk, which if I break it apart into little pieces is going to provide a lot of tannic astringency. It wants to shatter. It turns into dust, and then that's where that tannic astringency is mainly derived from. So with these wet milling systems, what it does is that hot water touches the barley kernel, and it starts to soak into the husk. It can't get into the endosperm because it's only there for 3 minutes, right? So by the time it arrives at the mill, the husk is fully hydrated. It's like soft and pliable and springy. And when it hits the rolls, and the endosperm is still hard and friable, like breakable, And when it hits the rolls, we can just blow it apart with a pretty intact husk and a very well crushed endosperm. And it's already mashing. So one of the things that, does Gordon, when Gordon says you don't even want to have it in there, well, that's because those tannins on the outside of, especially those dark malts, can tend to impart the harshness, the tannic astringency. And so this helps to minimize it. And that's a super expensive piece of kit, but one that makes better beer. And, could you do something like that at the homebrew scale? Absolutely. Good guy. Yeah, so anyways, that's how that works. Oh, and by the way, I got to get on another call, like not Vinny, but another call in just a few minutes because I host a virtual dive bar on Thursday nights for a bunch of my brewing buddies. So I'll need to get that fired up in a minute. Throw me another question.
Well, so I have the Gordon Strong book, and a lot of his recipes, he talks about a 90-minute mash time to reduce the DMS, and you talked about shorter mash times. And he also has very complicated step mashes and multiple decoctions, and other books doesn't do all that. But so with the highly modified grains, are these complicated step and decoction mashes really doing anything?
No. I think Gordon, I'm not sure where he's coming from, but unless he's using malts from the 1950s, then my guess would be that it's not a direction I would go. Now, I'm not telling you Gordon's wrong. He's, there's probably nuance in there, but from where I'm sitting, I'm not doing those. I'm not brewing beer like that right now.
So what's your opinion on Viking malts? Why? I've heard a lot of bad stuff about those.
Oh, I don't know that much about. I mean, Viking is, it's a large malting concern over in Europe, and they're trying to make forays into the U.S. market. I don't know. I've not used those malts, so I can't speak from direct experience. But they kind of know what the fuck they're doing. So I don't know what's coming in from that. There's some deal with, I think the Christensens up in North Dakota or something have got some deal that they're trying to, pull some of those malts over. But I mean, it's a big maltings,
But does the 90-minute mash reduce DMS?
No. The things that reduce DMS would be, so DMS, dimethyl sulfate, has a precursor which is called S-methylmethylene. That is created in malting. It's in barley, and it can be denatured or driven off when you dry the malt at higher temperatures. And so therefore, that's why the British pale ale malts don't tend to throw DMS, because that's been kind of blown out and put away. The other way that you get rid of DMS is that DMS in the kettle will convert with heat. It's highly volatile, so as the steam bubble evolves and moves up through the liquid column, it's selectively attracted and ejected from the boil. So if you were to taste the condensed steam coming off of a kettle boil, you would find it's outrageously high in DMS. But the DMS is not modified, to my knowledge, is not modified in mashing. It's really and it's about the precursor, which is then going to convert to it. So the S-methylmethylene. Now, interestingly, Rolling Rock, I don't know if any of you all drank Rolling Rock. I grew up on the East Coast, so we would drink it. And, it always had this fantastic, cooked corn flavor. It was disgusting with DMS. I mean, they had a minimum spec for the DMS precursors. And one person's, one person's flaw is a flavor attribute to others. I mean, I'm agnostic about whether these things are good or bad. Do I want them in my beer? No, I don't, because I don't prefer it, and it's not particularly controllable. So I don't want to do that.
Thank you.
Well, John, I just want to thank you. I know it's getting close to 9 o'clock here. Just want to thank you for talking to us a little bit. It's really it's made our club a little bit more cohesive, because in these times we're normally together. So we really appreciate it. Does anybody else have anything else to say before we wrap this up?
John, are you okay with us posting this video to YouTube?
Oh, absolutely. No problem at all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great. Anything else for the good of the order?
Do I need to YouTube? I thought TikTok's the thing now. Don't I need to do a dance or something?
We just got on YouTube. We're old school.
Well, thanks again, John, and thank you, Rick, for setting this up. And we all look forward to making some good beers.
Yeah, thanks again. It's a real pleasure. It's a real honor to be able to talk to homebrewing groups, especially because it is the heart of brewing. Larry Bell, the Bell's as a brewery is 35 years old, but Larry's been in business for longer than that, because he had a homebrew supply shop before the brewery for years. And we still are a homebrew supply shop, obviously, that's a really, it's a really important group of people because, I mean, fuck, if like homebrewers know how hard it is to make really good beer, and it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to passionate, fellow beer nerds. I always say yes to these kinds of things. So,
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. So,
Really
thank you for putting this together.
All right. Well, Andrew, if you could manage the details. John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rick,
Thank
you, John.
And
Thanks.
All right, cheers.
thank
Cheers.
you.
Yeah.
Cheers.